Thank you very much, Dr. Stepanie Seneff, for a very welcome return visit here on the Vitalstoff blog. We were happy to host you, I think it is 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, on the issue of glyphosate. And these are exciting very important times. And therefore, I'm very much looking forward to discussing the current crisis, the current situation with you, and to get your insight and your take on this, because you have a very particular angle. Just to explain to the audience who have missed the first show, Dr. Seneff is a computer scientist at MIT, that was her field of expertise after having completed a degree in biochemistry, I think it was, Stephanie? Biophysics. So it is a perfectly sound science background, and MIT is a very, very prominent institution. And that's where Dr. Seneff is working these days. And she is an expert on the research of how glyphosate works and what it messes up in our bodies. And from following her blog, her site, and also watching a lot of interviews Dr. Seneff did, I became aware that Dr. Seneff also has a very particular view on the current COVID crisis, which of course is something that needs to be taken seriously. There is definitely sadly, people dying, but I think we need to get to the core of what is behind all this. It is emerging science, and some of it is very early days, but there are very, very interesting insights to be gained from Dr. Seneff. Welcome, Stepanie.
So glad to be here. Thank you.
So, we are talking halfway around the globe. I am in
yes.
And you're in Hawaii, in the United States. So please give us an impression of what is the situation currently in the United States, and maybe even also in Hawaii. What is the situation, Stepanie?
Yes. Well, the United States is pretty much very close to the top in terms of the mortality rate from COVID-19. There's a whole set of countries that are experiencing quite high mortality rates from COVID-19, normalized by population. So forgetting how many COVID-19 diagnoses you have, because that's an issue, but dying is something you can recognize very clearly. And the United States has something like 300,000 deaths from COVID-19 so far. I think we're maybe the top in the world. Brazil is right behind us. Of course, we're big countries, so that it's 300,000 total deaths, but normalized by population, we're still very high. And Europe also, unfortunately, Western Europe, it has many countries in Western Europe are in that crowd of the top death rate from COVID-19. That's the number I like to look at, is mortality rate attributed to COVID-19. It's not perfect, because you could have people who were misdiagnosed as dying from COVID-19 when actually they had heart failure or something. You could quibble about it, but I think that's a pretty good parameter to use to compare countries. And what's shocking to me is when you look at countries that have incredibly lower, it's not like, 50% higher or 2 times as many, it's 100 times. So even if you look at Nigeria, and I like to look at Nigeria because it's an interesting example. Nigeria is a country that's very poor. It's almost entirely black. In the United States, the blacks have a much higher risk of dying than the whites. So there's some kind of susceptibility in being black. Nigeria has black. It has crowding in the cities. It has very relaxed control, face masks and social distancing are not being practiced very well there. And their death rate from COVID, and they also have really bad pollution. Like 94% of the people in the country are exposed to levels of air pollution that are higher than what the WHO recommends as a maximum level. So Nigeria's got all these different risk factors for COVID-19. And yet their death rate from COVID-19 is 1 in 100, normalized by population. For every 1 person that dies in Nigeria, 100 die in the United States. So that is a huge, huge difference. If you look at Taiwan, it's even more remarkable. Mm-hmm. Taiwan has had, last time I checked, which was just a month ago, 7 total deaths in the entire country. against our 300,000. So normalizing the population, you're still going to be way off, 7 total deaths. And they only have a few hundred cases in the entire country. So what is it about Taiwan? What is it about Nigeria that makes them, safe against COVID versus the United States and Western Europe, people are sick and dying from it? That's a huge question. And it's a question that needs to be answered. And it frustrates me that the media don't seem to be interested in that question. They should be, right? We should be looking at what is it that's protecting these people. Can we do that too? Because that would be the way really to solve the problem. They're not getting vaccines. It's not the reason why they're not getting it. Why are they safe? So that's the question I've been asking,
And have you already developed a hypothesis on why this might be, especially with regards to Taiwan, which I'm not very familiar with?
Absolutely, yes. Taiwan. So here's my theory, which is that air pollution is playing a major role, but only certain kinds of air pollution, number one. And number two, biofuels are playing an essential role. And countries that are leaders in the biofuel. So biofuel is this way of trying to reduce consumption of petroleum. It's sort of a feel-good kind of thing. Let's make fuel out of, crops. And so, like, for example, you grow wheat, you harvest the wheat, and then you take what's left over and turn the crank and turn it into biofuel. And you can make biodiesel, biogas, bioethanol, which the United States is very big on. We have 10% ethanol typically in our gasoline. I think Europe has 5% ethanol. Europe is very big on biodiesel, and I think that's a problem in Europe. And Europe buys a lot of biodiesel from Argentina, and they make it out of GMO Roundup Ready soy. So you start to get into the glyphosate issue, because when I look at the biofuels and how they're made, I can see huge possibilities for glyphosate getting into the biofuels. This is what I think is happening. The biofuels are contaminated with glyphosate. This is a theory. Nobody's proved it.
Right.
But it makes sense to me.
And then from there, the biofuel would go to the combustion engine and be exhausted into the environment.
Right. So the combustion, if the glyphosate makes it to the point where it goes through the combustion engine, it will disintegrate. It'll release probably phosphorus oxides, and that might be a problem. I don't know, but it will no longer be glyphosate, because the temperature is much higher than the temperature at which glyphosate is destroyed. However, what if it doesn't reach the combustion engine? And there are ways it might not. One of them is a big one with biogas, because biogas, for example, New York City and also Chelsea in Massachusetts, which has the highest death rate in Massachusetts, is in Chelsea. Chelsea is a city near Boston, right next door to the airport. It has these big tanks. It has the river that goes through it, the Charles River, and there are these big tanks that store fuel, and it stores all the fuel that supplies Logan Airport. All of it is stored in Chelsea. So these huge tanks are there. It's quite interesting to drive through Chelsea. They have biogas. They have been a leader in the biofuel development since way back, like 2002, 2003 timeframe. They've been a leader. And they make biofuels also out of waste food products like food oil. They actually had an accident there one time where one of the food oil tanks caught on fire. So biofuel is very much a presence in Chelsea. Chelsea is an old city. It has a lot of pipes underneath it that supply gas. And part of that gas is biogas. So biogas in leaky pipes under a city is going to leak glyphosate if the biogas contains glyphosate. That's not going to be combusted at all. It's just going to be released because, into the air from the biogas, from the leaks in the fuel lines. And so that's just an example of how biogas could get out. But at the place where they're making the biofuels, there's another possibility. And many of these manufacturing plants are near the city. So, for example, New York City has New York is a leader in the biofuel industry. New York City is the only city I have found in the world that I haven't looked everywhere, but that actually requires 5% bio in home heating oil. So if you heat your home with oil, you have to have 5% by law if you live in New York City. New York State subsidized. So if you use more than 5% elsewhere in the New York State, you get a tax break. So they're incentivizing people to use bio in their home heating oil. Biodiesel is also something that New York City has been a leader in, and they have 11,000 vehicles, state-owned vehicles in New York City running on biodiesel fuel. And so a lot of these vehicles, there's old buses, for example, that, when an old bus starts up and it spews out all those fumes and you start choking, if you're behind it, there's lots of organic matter in there that didn't get combusted, and glyphosate could easily be in that organic matter. So I think, and also at the gas tank, when you're filling up, at the gas station, when you're filling up the gas tank, ways for the glyphosate to escape there. So I think or even on the barge, when the actual resources that are going to go into the biofuel, you grow the wheat, you spray it with glyphosate right before harvest, you harvest it, and then you take what's the residue and you put it onto a barge and ship it down to New York City. While it's on the barge, it can also be emitting glyphosate, from those crops. So I think there's various ways it could get into the air. Glyphosate has been found in air samples, in water samples, from rain. And my friend Anthony Samsel's been collecting water samples from rain from various places around the world from his friends. I gave him 3 samples, one from Kauai, one from my home in Winchester, which is a northern suburb of Cambridge, and then one from Cambridge where I work at MIT. Those 3 samples, 2 of them were negative, 1 was positive. And you can guess which one was positive, which was the Cambridge sample. In the city, the rain had glyphosate in it, and I think it picked it up from the air as it came down.
So that would mean the glyphosate molecule would go airborne, right?
That's what I'm thinking. Airborne glyphosate, you breathe it, and glyphosate is, I know glyphosate is very destructive of the innate immune system. I have a book, as I mentioned to you, I'm working on a book. I'm hoping it'll come out middle of next year, so June 2021. The title is Toxic Legacy, How the Herbicide Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment. All about glyphosate. And there's a whole chapter on immune system, and especially the innate immune system. Right. And I explained in that chapter how I would predict that glyphosate would disrupt the innate immune system. It's very clear to me. And we have in the United States an epidemic in autoimmune disease, partly because of all the vaccines we're getting, because the vaccines, I think the whole concept of vaccine is based on a false premise. Mm-hmm. It's flawed. And the idea with the vaccine is that you've got to have antibodies in order to be safe from these diseases. And the whole point of the vaccine is to completely bypass the innate immune system, go straight to the adaptive. And the adaptive immune system is where you get the antibodies. The vaccine doesn't work if it doesn't make antibodies. However, if you make too many antibodies, and especially if things get into the brain and you make antibodies in the brain, you get autoimmune disease. And we have an absolute epidemic in autoimmune disease in this country. Rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis, and even I think autism has an autoimmune component to it, and inflammatory bowel. There's just a whole list. Celiac disease. We have an epidemic in people who can't eat wheat, and wheat, of course, is sprayed with glyphosate right before harvest. And I'm very confident that glyphosate is the reason why we have an epidemic in gluten intolerance in this country. Mm-hmm. So basically, the glyphosate disrupts the innate immune system. So when you get exposed to some pathogen, such as a virus, your innate immune system throws up its hands in despair. It says, I can't deal with this. You got to help me out. And it pulls in the adaptive immune system. And once you make the antibodies, then it's much easier to clear the bug. And of course, then you get the memory antibodies. If the disease was severe enough, your adaptive system makes the memory cells make antibodies that will then be ready to go as soon as the virus comes back again. And that's what the whole principle of the vaccine is. You've got those antibodies ready to go. But people who have a healthy immune system don't need antibodies at all. They can just slough off the virus, no problem, because their innate system is able to do the job without any help. And what's happening in this country is very few people in this country have a healthy innate immune system. Right. And that's why we're so sick. That's why we can't fight off this virus. And of course, that greatly spreads infection rate too, because the contagion goes way up. Because if I get sick and I make tons more viruses and I'm coughing them up, the next person over there is going to pick them up. So the viruses are spreading like crazy because the people who are getting sick can't fight it off, and they just make more. Mm-hmm. It's a total feedback loop. And then the whole population gets sick, So
let's talk for a moment about the pathology of this virus, SARS-CoV-2, which just the other day I heard a doctor who had given a presentation at Congress, Senate hearing, Dr. Corey it was. He said people are not dying of the virus; they are dying mm-hmm. of the immune reaction, which at a later stage becomes so so powerful and overwhelming that multi-organ failure would actually result in death eventually if this immune reaction could not be controlled by any other way. So how would in this this picture, how would glyphosate interfere in making a disease worse?
Yeah, I mean, that of course gets very complicated science, and it's hard to know where to begin. Zach Bush, by the way, is also talking about glyphosate. I know you mentioned Zach Bush before we started this, but he's a friend of mine, and I think he's awesome, and he's got an amazing message that I am in complete agreement with what he's saying, and he's saying the innate immune system is too weak and it's weakened by glyphosate. So it's the same thing I'm saying. Glyphosate is destroying the innate immune system, its ability to clear viruses, and
that would be the level of T cell and
yeah, well, so the macrophages, you know, and it's basically the macrophages that are not able to clear the viruses. And in fact, a good example with respect to biofuels has to do with a disease that is caused by smoking e-cigarettes. I don't know if you've heard about this. There's a lung disease that's caused by smoking e-cigarettes. They can't figure out what's going on with it. It looks exactly like COVID-19 in terms of its symptoms, you know, slight fever, dry cough, no runny nose, which is a characteristic feature of the COVID disease. And it's caused by smoking these e-cigarettes. And that's just quite interesting because e-cigarettes are, the base of the e-cigarettes is glycerol. And glycerol is a byproduct, the major byproduct of the biofuel industry. So I think the glycerol is contaminated with glyphosate. When you smoke the e-cigarette, you're smoking glyphosate. And when you get glyphosate in your lungs, it destroys the immune system in the lungs. And there was a specific, a very interesting paper where they exposed mice to e-cigarette fumes. And then they exposed them for, I think, 3 months. And then they exposed them to the flu virus. And they were predicting that the e-cigarette fumes would cause them to overreact to the flu virus and cause an overzealous adaptive immune system to cause trouble and to harm, to injure the lungs. And that is exactly what happened with these mice. And then they looked at the lung tissue to figure out what was going on specifically. And one of the things they found that I thought was really striking is that there were these surfactant proteins, surfactant protein A and D, they're called, in the lung surfactants that are designed to trap viruses. And those proteins were deficient in these mice that were exposed to these fumes. And they were remaining inside the cell. They weren't being released into the surfactants. This is because I think they were getting messed up by glyphosate. And the reason why I think this, it gets a little bit complicated. We have to go back to glyphosate's mechanism of toxicity. And this is something I've been claiming for a long time, and I've written several papers on this topic. I believe glyphosate has a unique insidious mechanism of toxicity that has to do with its action as an analog of glycine. And glycine is the smallest amino acid. It's one of the basic building blocks of proteins. And glyphosate is a complete glycine molecule, except that it has this extra methylphosphonate unit attached to its nitrogen atom. So the part that is the core of the amino acid has no side chain in glycine. That's how the system that assembles the proteins recognizes glycine, because it has no side chain. Glyphosate also has no side chain. Like glycine, it's a protein, an amino acid without side chains. So it fits into that pocket. It's got this extra stuff dangling off of its nitrogen atom, but its nitrogen atom has to stay outside of the pocket because it has to hook up. They're like paper dolls hooking up on the chain. The nitrogen is outside of the pocket. So glyphosate's happy to fit in there and mess things up. And so I think that proteins that have critical glycine residues become damaged by glyphosate so that they don't work anymore. And these surfactant proteins have something that's called a stalk, which is made up, it's a collagen-like stalk. And it's made up of long sequences of amino acids where every third amino acid is a glycine. GXY, 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 that's how they talk about these motifs. XY is wild card. So every third amino acid in that sequence for a long time is a glycine. Tremendous opportunity for glyphosate to substitute for glycine and mess it up. And when glyphosate substitutes, it will cause the protein not to be able to form these alpha helix structure. The collagen has this triple helix structure that these collagen-like proteins depend upon in order to work properly. So they're getting messed up by the glyphosate. before they even get out the door. So these surfactant proteins are not there to help clear the virus. So when the virus comes in, it's flying around. If you have a fly flying around in the room instead of stuck on tar paper, it's a lot harder to catch, So the viruses are not being trapped. They're not being cleared by the macrophages because of that. And then the virus gets a chance to infect the cells and multiply and all of that. And then the adaptive system comes in because the innate system failed. And the adaptive system starts making these antibodies, and then and also this inflammatory response and all this stuff that causes all this lung tissue damage. The immune system is basically killing off the self in the attempt to try to clear these viruses that are unable to be trapped.
Right. So basically, you're right, it was very dense information. To sum it up for the audience, is it fair to say that the unique property or unique characteristic of glyphosate being, in effect, a glycine analog with some little part attached, this little part attached will then eventually cause the messing up because the glycine doesn't fit in the place where, the glyphosate doesn't fit in the place where the glycine would be.
It messes up the ability for the protein to fold properly because of that extra bulk that's in the way. And in fact, those glycines have to hook together in those helices, and they can't because there's stuff in the way.
Right. That was I was going to come to, because we're talking here about immune system. A lot depends on enzymes and enzyme function. And if I remember correctly from our first talk, this is where glyphosate has its most destructive effect in messing up enzyme function, and that is in the first place what it was designed to do, messing up the shikimate pathway. So
that's right.
Plants to become to die eventually, not of the glyphosate but of the immune defect which then results. Anyway, so enzyme function being messed up on a very
on a global scale. I mean, it's really incredible. And you can identify which enzymes, and I talk a lot about this in my book, exactly the details of exactly the situation in which glyphosate is most likely to disrupt an enzyme. And this has to do with enzymes that have a highly conserved glycine at a place where they bind phosphate. So it's very specific. And this is not the case with this, it's somewhat the case with this, with those surfactant proteins, but there's a whole bunch of proteins that bind phosphate containing molecules. And one of them is EPSP synthase. And it binds PEP, it binds the phosphate of PEP at the place where glyphosate disrupts it, and it has the glycine residue there. And if glyphosate messes it up there, and if glyphosate were to substitute for that glycine, it would completely explain what's going on. Because when you get rid of that glycine, if you change the code so that code codes for alanine instead, it's a minimal change. The most similar amino acid is alanine to glycine. You change the code so that it codes for alanine. And now glyphosate this enzyme is completely insensitive to glyphosate. And that's what they put into the GMO Roundup Ready crops. They put in a version of that enzyme that has alanine instead of glycine. And it works beautifully. It doesn't even see glyphosate, which is really interesting, just that one small change. That's why I think that's how you best explain how it's affecting EPSP synthase. And when you say it's doing that, and then you look at other enzymes, there's an enzyme that binds the same molecule, PEP, at a site where it also has a highly conserved glycine residue, exactly the same setup, a human enzyme, which is PEPCK, phosphoenolpyruvate carboxykinase. Very, very important in the liver. And if that enzyme's not working, it explains a lot of the diseases that are going up dramatically in step with glyphosate usage, particularly fatty liver disease. And that's been very clearly linked to glyphosate. That enzyme alone could explain fatty liver disease.
Right. And the liver, of course, is the detoxifying organ.
Right. And in fact, many of the enzymes that detoxify also are going to be susceptible to glyphosate through this phosphate binding problem. All the cytochrome P450 enzymes have been shown to be suppressed by glyphosate. And I'm not surprised, because that you have that same setup, binding phosphate at a place where there's a glycine that's highly conserved. That's the pattern I'm seeing for enzymes that are associated with diseases that are going up exactly in step with glyphosate, and then have this pattern which would give you the susceptibility to glyphosate. The pattern works really beautifully. And so we have a huge number of diseases that are going up dramatically in this country: diabetes, obesity, autism, Alzheimer's disease, pancreatic cancer, thyroid cancer, inflammatory bowel, celiac disease, all these different diseases that are going up dramatically. Many of which are autoimmune diseases, and I think I can go rummage through the literature and find the proteins that are blamed for those diseases and find the place where they bind phosphate at a highly conserved glycine, and I can check them off one by one. It's really quite remarkable. It's a remarkable story.
Right. Wow. So just one thought came to my mind while you were speaking, and that is, now if we then we're being told, the issue of masks, so SARS-CoV-2 being airborne and therefore the need to protect ourselves by those ways. If it is accepted that this virus can stay a long way in the air with lipids, with droplets and aerosols, then it should be also clear that stuff like glyphosate also can
Exactly.
stay up in the air for a long time, and this makes intake of this toxin, of course, much more prevalent, much more likely.
Yeah, so the nanoparticles, actually, they've shown that the virus, there's a study that showed that the virus gets trapped in those nanoparticles. So when you have high nanoparticle levels, which is an air pollution measure, you have a higher risk of transmitting the COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 through those nanoparticles. And so this is how you could link air pollution to glyphosate.
To
COVID-19.
Which would explain, at least some way, seasonality. Because if I remember correctly, what Dr. Zach Bush has been saying is that, in the summer, when it's all the leaves on the trees and stuff, which cleared the air, there's much less of this nanoparticles around.
That's very interesting.
To breathe, whereas in winter, when all the leaves been dropped, so everything stays much longer in the air. Therefore, the risk of taking it in levels which may be problematic to the body are much more likely.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that's maybe the primary reason why there's more in the winter.
Right.
That's a good theory.
So, talking about Dr. Zach Bush, you mentioned him, and I also had a privilege of translating one of his talks. Dr. Bush has been hinting at something which is also familiar to you, and also in your way of thinking about the nature of viruses. So are viruses an enemy? Dr. Bush says clearly no, because evolution has been going on the level of viruses long before any other form of life has been around, and we have incorporated much of this genetic information. So it is not so much a question of enemy. How can one get a grip on the concept of what a virus is and what makes a virus problematic and which one is not? So do you have on this?
Well, yeah. In fact, of course, Judy Mikovits is a friend of mine, and she's talked a lot about the viruses, not so much as of them being your friend, but of them, the retroviruses and how they can help to assist in bringing the RNA from an RNA virus into the nucleus to actually become permanent within the body. And in fact, there are endogenous retroviruses that are now in our DNA, and actually I think maybe 10% of our DNA is known to be derived from viruses. And I suspect more is, we just don't know about those earlier viruses. I think viruses are agents of evolution. And we've had a lot of issues with crazy new viruses showing up in the past, 40 years. And I suspect that many of them are a consequence of glyphosate's toxicity. Because when I think about glyphosate, and if I'm my organism and how am I going to fix the problems that glyphosate is producing, I think the viruses, I think there's a whole mechanism in biology of viruses sort of playing around with different ideas and trying to find the right solution for compensating for what the toxic chemicals in the environment are doing to damage us. So the viruses are looking to find a solution that will actually long-term protect us and make us healthier in the face of these toxic chemicals that we're exposed to. So because glyphosate is such a horrendous toxic chemical causing so many problems, the viruses are struggling to find the solution. You know, they're working hard to figure out what can we do to compensate for this glyphosate problem. And it's, you know, one thing that I've been looking into is tuberculosis versus COVID-19. And that's a very interesting story, because when you look at Africa, so tuberculosis is endemic in some countries and pretty rare in other countries. I think the US has something like 5% infection rate with the tuberculosis, B tuberculosis, what is it? I forgot the B, but there's a tuberculosis organism. It's a bacterium.
Deuterium, yeah.
Mycobacterium M tuberculosis, I think. Anyway, I've lost that. Not sure. Anyway, there's a tuberculosis bacterium, and there's a tuberculosis vaccine. And there was initially some interest in the idea that the tuberculosis vaccine might protect from COVID-19, because that someone did a study and they showed that the countries that required that vaccine had generally lower death rates from COVID-19 compared to the countries that don't require that vaccine. US is one of the few countries that don't require that vaccine, which is surprising because we require more vaccines than any other country, but we don't have a big problem with tuberculosis. Africa, of course, is one of the hardest, probably the hardest hit continent with tuberculosis, and they have a pretty high mortality rate from tuberculosis. They have a serious problem with that microbe. However, I think the tuberculosis infection, not the vaccine, but the infection, protects from COVID-19. And I suspect it does so by actually solving the same problem that the COVID-19 virus is trying to solve. So it's really, really fascinating science. And it gets into the whole issue of deuterium, which is another whole story. I've zeroed in on deuterium just since last December, and I've been absolutely fascinated with deuterium, particularly because I became aware that the enzymes that manage deuterium in the body, many of them have this property of having glycine residues at phosphate binding sites, so they have susceptibility to glyphosate to mess them up. Furthermore, deuterium is a very complicated story, but let me start with telling you what it is. This is worth talking about because it hits directly on COVID-19, and very, very interesting what we're working out. I think this is potentially revolutionary science in metabolism. And I learned this from Laszlo Boros. He's from Hungary, and Hungary, Ukraine, and Russia have been leaders in studying deuterium and its role in the body and how it's managed in the body. Deuterium is heavy hydrogen. So hydrogen is the smallest atom. It's on the very top of the left top corner of the periodic table. One proton, one electron. Deuterium has one proton, one electron, one neutron. So it's a natural isotope of hydrogen found in all the water. You know, you can't really remove deuterium from water completely. So all the water has deuterium, and typically the level is 155 parts per million of water molecules contain deuterium instead of hydrogen. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but deuterium is levels in the blood are considerably high, like 5 times as high as the level of calcium in the blood. Calcium, of course, is a very important mineral. So when you look at the levels of deuterium in the blood compared to the levels of the various minerals, they're much higher. So deuterium is actually a major player in biology and has very different properties from hydrogen. Hydrogen, of course, is by far the most common molecule atom in our body. I think 99% of the atoms in our body are hydrogen atoms. So it's really, I mean, we're practically made out of hydrogen. You know, they're very tiny, so they take up a lot less room. But the mitochondria produce ATP, which is the energy currency for the organism. Those are those little organelles inside the cells, the mitochondria. They produce ATP. And the ATPase pumps that make the ATP absolutely hate deuterium. Okay. Deuterium wrecks those pumps, just like putting sugar in the gas tank. So the whole system, the whole organism obsesses on making sure that when you deliver water to the mitochondria, it doesn't have deuterium in it. It's very, very interesting. And so these proteins that bind phosphate at sites that have glycines, they are major players in the process that delivers the deuterium-depleted water to the mitochondria. So what happens with glyphosate, I think, is that those proteins are getting disrupted. The mitochondria are getting gummed up with deuterium. When that happens, they make less ATP and they spew out reactive oxygen species. So they start damaging themselves, damaging their DNA. You get mitochondrial disorders. And mitochondrial dysfunction is associated with a huge list of diseases. Most of those diseases that I mentioned that are going up in step with glyphosate usage are associated with mitochondrial dysfunction.
Right.
So the mitochondria get sick, you can't make enough energy, you're spewing out these reactive oxygen species, you're basically killing off your cells. And your cells are desperate in that situation. They have to do something to fix that, or you'll die. So this is what I think is happening with glyphosate. I think all of us that are exposed to glyphosate have some degree of damage in our mitochondria as a consequence of that. And the glyphosate accumulates over time, so you get worse and worse as you get older. Your mitochondria get sicker and sicker as you get older.
Right. So again, just to clarify, the glyphosate messes up the enzymes which would otherwise keep deuterium from being delivered to the mitochondria.
Right.
Therefore, there's an accumulation of deuterium-enriched water in the mitochondria, which makes mitochondria go defunct and cause all the problems with the cell, basically leading to cell death eventually.
Right. Right. So getting back to tuberculosis, I think so the lungs actually are a really good place to try to fix the problem, it turns out, of deuterium. And so various diseases that have to do with the lungs, and you've got COPD and asthma, and you've got pneumonia and tuberculosis. So tuberculosis in particular, I suspect tuberculosis is very good at helping to solve the deuterium problem. And then COVID-19 does the same, SARS-CoV-2 does the same thing. It's a similar, it's a very different mechanism by which it does it, but it's a similar effect, is to try to fix. And the goal is to fix the macrophages first. So the immune system is in big trouble because its mitochondria aren't working. And if you can repair the macrophages, then the macrophages can clear the virus and you can get on with business. And as long as you've got a strong innate immune system, you don't need to worry about infective diseases at all, any of them, I think, if you've got a strong innate immune system. So the whole goal is to get those macrophages back in shape. And the COVID-19 is really, really fascinating. First of all, I guess the tuberculosis. So it turns out the vaccine did not turn out to be protective in Israel, where they don't have much tuberculosis, but they require the vaccine. And they did a nice study there where they looked at the boundary between when they didn't require it and when they did, and looked at the people who lived around that, who were in that age group that got it, to compare their COVID-19 cases, and they didn't find any difference. So they said, well, as far as Israel's concerned, that vaccine doesn't work at all. They were hoping to find that it would, because people were saying that the tuberculosis vaccine might be a protective against COVID-19. But then if you look at tuberculosis itself in Africa, it's quite remarkable, because I have a chart of a color-coded chart of the rate of the infection rate or death rate from tuberculosis in African countries, and another one of the death rate from COVID-19 in African countries. And they are exact mirror image of each other. The ones that have more COVID have less tuberculosis, and vice versa. It's really interesting. And so I think tuberculosis itself is protective. And in Africa, 80% of the people in Africa are infected with the TB bacterium. 80%. Many of them don't have any symptoms because they've got a perfectly strong immune system. They don't need to get sick. So the ones that catch tuberculosis are the ones who have a weakened innate immune system, and the tuberculosis is helping to fix that innate immune system. But the other ones, the tuberculosis is there in a latent infection, and it's going about its business to help improve their immune system all the time. So that's become a beneficial component of their whole microbiome system, is that tuberculosis bacterium sitting there quietly doing its job and not causing any trouble. And this is what I think is going to happen with SARS-CoV-2, actually. I think it's going to infect people who are healthy and play a role as a latent virus. And throughout your lifespan, it's going to continue to help to offset the damage that glyphosate is causing with respect to that deuterium problem. And it does it very elegantly, because I found a great paper on COVID-19. I know I'm bouncing around a bit here because there's so many things to cover and it's hard to kind of tie them all together. But going back to SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, there was a beautiful paper that talked about again, a sort of a strong immune reaction to the virus infection in the lungs, causing, and particularly because it binds to the ACE2 receptor, that turns out to have consequences in terms of causing an increase in bradykinin. It's a bioactive signaling molecule, bradykinin, that gets produced in large quantities in these people who have a severe reaction to COVID-19. It gets produced in the lungs. Bradykinin, and that protein causes a whole reaction that's very, very interesting. that several things happen, but one is a huge overproduction of a molecule called hyaluronic acid.
Mm-hmm.
And this molecule produces gelled water in the lungs. So it also causes the leaky blood vessels. It causes the lipids. It causes reactive oxygen species. It produces superoxide and things like that. That this is the inflammatory response that then oxidizes the fats that are in the membrane of the virus. So the virus actually picks up linoleic acid from the host cell's membrane as it passes through. The virus has these little pockets that exactly fit in its protein, in that spike protein. It has these little pockets where you could stick linoleic acid. So it puts all these fatty acids in its membrane. And then those get attacked by these reactive oxygen species. And in particular, an enzyme called lipoxygenase gets upregulated. That enzyme converts that linoleic acid into other things, sort of modified fatty acids. But that enzyme, lipoxygenase, is the most effective enzyme by far that I have found that can choose hydrogen over deuterium. It has a tremendous ability to makes water, and it makes that water from hydrogen, not deuterium. So it produces deuterium depleted water, that enzyme, by modifying these fatty acids that are around the virus particle. And at the same time, the hyaluronic acid traps deuterium in gelled water. So what happens is that the alveoli, which are supposed to be filled with air, and that's when you're breathing, you have those little circles, those little alveoli that are picking up the air to get the oxygen in. Those guys get filled up with gelled water because of the hyaluronic acid. And that gelled water pulls deuterium out of the fluid water. And then in the interstitial spaces between the blood vessels and the alveoli is where the macrophages come crowding in. They're attracted to this whole situation. And the lipoxygenase is producing deuterium depleted water while the hyaluronic acid is sucking deuterium out of the water. So the net result is really healthy water in the lungs, in that space where the macrophages are swarming in. And the macrophages then have a technique called macrophinocytosis. It's kind of a wonderful word. Big drink cell or something, cellular process, so they big drink. So they just make a big circle, pull in that beautiful deuterium depleted water and use it to fix their mitochondria. This is what I think is going on. And that paper describes most of that. Of course, the paper doesn't talk about deuterium. It doesn't have any clue about that, but that's what's going on, I think, is that you can fill the lungs with fluid, and that fluid can be really healthy water, and you can get those macrophages to come in and fix their mitochondria. Now they're good to go. Now they can clear the virus. So if all goes well, you get fluid-filled lungs, you have shortness of breath, the macrophages get fixed, they clear the virus, and you're done deal. You're all set. No antibodies.
So what we've just experienced is, I would say, fireworks of theoretical biochemistry, right?
Yes.
So one would need, or what is needed now is some form of studies being designed to disprove or prove
exactly
these hypotheses.
Right, and the first thing to do would be to get a hold of that fluid water in the lung interstitial tissues and measure how much deuterium is in there, because that would be a very obvious first step. If I were an active biologist with a laboratory, which I'm not, I would love to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody listening who has the facilities or knows someone who has the facilities, that would be a really fun thing to do, to see if there is in fact high quality water in those interstitial fluids where those macrophages are swarming.
Right. Wow. So, but to come back to the current situation, what would be, apart from this very basic science research aspect what we just discussed now, what would be your suggestion for the country, for the people, for the government to be doing now to get us out of the situation? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, well, I find I'm very frustrated that in the United States, certainly, we have a very strong pharma lobby, and pharma is making sure that all the good ideas don't happen with respect to fixing the COVID problem. I feel there's no mention of vitamin D, for example. I mean, you see articles on the web that are telling you vitamin D is super important to fight off COVID. And that makes sense. Vitamin D is very important for the immune system, for the innate immune system. Glyphosate, by the way, disrupts the enzyme that activates vitamin D in the liver. That's a CYP enzyme. So we have a massive epidemic in vitamin D deficiency in this country right now. People are popping vitamin D pills like there's no tomorrow, you know. They're all trying to get their vitamin D up, but glyphosate is preventing them from activating it. And so, and without activated vitamin D, it's not going to work. And so I think that's a huge player right there, the glyphosate messing up the vitamin D. Vitamin D, I think vitamin D deficiency had something like 4 times the risk of death from COVID compared to vitamin D sufficiency. Yeah. And so, so one thing is just, well, certainly what they should be saying. If I were the government, I would say, okay, guys, no more glyphosate. You got to eat organic food. We're going to have to find a way to get more organic food. We got to get organic farming, you know, stop the glyphosate immediately. Anyone who's young and able, you know, get yourself some land and start growing organic food because we need it desperately. So, because if we all start eating organic, we're going to run out very soon. We're already way we have grossly inadequate supply within the United States of certified organic because we have a great increase in interest in buying it. It flies off the shelves. You know, in our grocery stores, we're seeing more and more certified organic becoming available. And you'll see bananas, you know, organic, not organic, and the non-organic shelf is empty because people bought them already, you know. So people are becoming aware you need to eat organic. That is really number one. Stop exposing yourself to glyphosate. And they should also be saying, get out in the sunlight, get your vitamin D, you know. Get as much sunlight exposure as you can, especially these days. Get your vitamin D up. Vitamin K is another one. Vitamin K2, that also, deficiency in that has also been shown to cause increased risk to COVID, bad outcomes for COVID. Vitamin K2 is present in fermented foods. So eat a lot of fermented foods. So this is what I'm doing. Eat a lot of fermented foods. Get out in the sunlight. Eat certified organic diet. I soak in Epsom salt baths because sulfate deficiency is a key problem that's associated with all of this. And I didn't get into it today, but I've talked a lot about sulfate. That's also a problem with the mitochondria, with the mitochondria, but also the macrophages. Insufficient sulfate impairs their ability to clear the viruses. And glyphosate, of course, messes up sulfate big time. And I've talked about that before. But probably the last time I talked to you, I talked about sulfate. I don't remember, but we did. Anyway, so Epsom salt baths is a good way to get sulfate through the skin. Let's see what else. Apple cider vinegar might be a way to metabolize glyphosate in the gut because it contains acetobacter, and acetobacter are one of the few bacteria that have been shown to be able to break down glyphosate. Glyphosate has a bond that's particularly difficult to break down, so only a few microbes know how to do that. But acetobacter, at least some strains of acetobacter are able to do that. That's another one that we should check out. But I like to get apple cider vinegar and sauerkraut for that reason, because they have acetobacter and probably fermented foods in general. Let's see. So what else can I think about? Oh, and then there's also, well, I have a friend who's been looking at complicated molecules that are produced by various plants that are actually come out of that shikimate pathway, which is the pathway that glyphosate disrupts. So one of the things is glyphosate prevents the plants from making these molecules. These molecules are important for their own to deal with stress for the plant itself, but they're also useful for humans. If you eat those molecules, they actually help to fix the deuterium problem, in fact, because they provide mechanisms by which it's again complicated biophysics, but these are polyphenols, flavonoids, terpenoids, those kinds of things that come out of interesting herbs and spices. And so I've been taking tincture of licorice and tincture of rosemary, and you can get that on the web. Because I have a friend who's an expert in sort of nutraceuticals, and he says that they contain these special molecules that can help to prevent the virus from infecting the cell. So if you do all of that, I think you can be very brave and go out and live your life and not worry about getting COVID-19. That's my belief. And the government should be telling us that. That's the other part of my belief. They should be telling us that. Instead, they're suppressing, things like hydroxychloroquine and this ivermectin. Yeah. That's very interesting. I've seen a doctor in America gave an impassioned speech. Did you see that at FDA?
Yeah, Corey. That was Dr. Corey.
Oh, that was Corey. Okay, good. Yes, great. Because it's showing such good effects, and the government poo-poos it because it's an old drug, it's cheap. I mean, they don't want old, cheap drugs. They want, vaccines and fancy new drugs that cost lots of money. Pharma wants us to believe that that's the only way we can fix ourselves. And it's just not true. I mean, if we just maintain our good physical health and keep a strong immune system, we don't have to worry about COVID-19 at all. We probably wouldn't even get sick. We might get a flu-like experience, I believe.
So in essence, this would also mean you subscribe to what Dr. Bush is saying, systems biology approach. So getting back to the so-called normal or organic way of living in the
yes,
winter.
Absolutely.
Getting off burning fossil fuels and using combustion engines. So to minimize the air pollution, which will keep any virus afloat because of the nanoparticles which you mentioned. Yeah.
Right. Yes. So it's really unfortunate that the United States it frustrates me that they're not aware of the role that glyphosate is playing. I really believe glyphosate is playing a major role in our inability to fight off this disease. And there's no peep about that. No one dares to say anything about that because of the lobby, agrochemical lobby.
Before I let you go, can you talk briefly about when your book to come out and how to get it?
Yes, it's Chelsea Green is the publisher, and they think it's going to be released in, excuse me, I got a throat tickle in my throat, June of 2021.
Right.
So it'll be available on Amazon.
Which is in itself, well, it is.
Yes. Amazon's doing well these days.
Yeah. Already any plans for having it translated into other languages?
Oh, that's a good question. Not yet, I guess. I'm sure they'll see how well it sells and then go from there.
Right, of course. So all I can say is I'm looking very much looking forward to reading your book, and I thank you for your explanations and your insight you've given us. Any thing you would like to add for the audience?
I mean, it's just the same that I've been saying. I think we need to move quickly if we want to survive long term on this planet. To move towards the small organic farms, renewable agriculture. It's the only path to take. We need to get rid of not just glyphosate, but all the toxic chemicals that are being used in agriculture. I think that's the primary, most important thing we need to do right now.
Right, thank you. Would you also like to give a website or something where people can access?
Oh, yes. I have a website, StepanieSeneff.net, which is kind of easy to remember, myname.net. And that points to my MIT website, which has all kinds of, it's rather dry looking, but it has all kinds of materials, my published papers and various slideshows and interviews and presentations, a lot of stuff on my MIT webpage, but the StepanieSeneff.net will get you there if you look for more information.
I will put it into the show notes and into the subtext of the video. Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Stepanie Seneff, for this very entertaining and informative and groundbreaking, I would say, talk on the connection between COVID-19 and glyphosate. We've been happy to have you and wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.